Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. When 62-year-old rancher Amos Reddick discovers a collapsed sinkhole behind his barn, he expects just another problem on his failing ranch. But when he clears the rubble and finds a tunnel carved into stone, everything changes. Inside lies an underground hideout untouched for nearly a century, filled with gold bars, faded documents, and his grandfather's journals. The journals reveal a sacred promise made between settlers and indigenous families: to use hidden wealth to build a school, a hospital, a better future. The promise was never kept. Now Amos must decide: keep the fortune that could save his ranch, or honor the dream his grandfather abandoned. What would you do if it was yours? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun rose the way it always did over Reddick Ranch, painting the high desert in shades of amber and rust. Amos stood on his porch, with coffee going cold in his hands, watching light creep across land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. At 62, he knew every fence post, every gully, every stubborn patch of sage that refused to clear. He knew where the ground held water and where it turned to dust. He knew this place the way you know your own hands. The ranch house sat in a valley rimmed with red rock cliffs, 20 miles from the nearest town. Juniper trees dotted the slopes, their twisted trunks speaking to years of wind and drought. The barn showed its age: weathered wood, a roof that needed patching, doors that hung crooked on rusted hinges. But it stood, same as it had for 70 years. Same as Amos intended to keep standing, though some days he wondered how much longer he could manage it. He'd been up since 4:30. Old habit. When you run cattle, even a small herd, the work starts before dawn. He'd already checked the stock tank, found it lower than he liked. The well pump was acting up again, and calling the repairman meant money he didn't have. Everything came down to money these days, or the lack of it. Sarah used to say he was stubborn as the land itself. She'd stand right here on this porch, arms crossed, shaking her head at his refusal to consider selling, to consider retirement, to consider anything except staying put and working until his bones wore out. "Amos Reddick," she'd say, "you're going to die with your boots on and dirt under your fingernails, and I suppose that's exactly how you want it." She'd been right, of course. Sarah was right about most things. But she'd been gone 2 years now, and the silence she left behind felt heavier than any physical work. Some mornings he still turned to say something to her, forgetting for just a moment. Then the emptiness would rush back in, and he'd stand there feeling foolish and old and alone. He finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail. Time to start the day properly. The cattle were Herefords, sturdy red and white animals his father had favored. He ran about 40 head now, down from the 150 his grandfather had managed in the good years. The market wasn't kind to small operations anymore. Big corporate ranchers could afford to ride out bad years, but places like his lived season to season, hoping beef prices stayed stable and veterinary emergencies stayed rare. Miguel Ortega met him by the barn, already saddling his horse. Miguel had worked the ranch for 30 years, since he was 20, and Amos was 32. He was more than an employee. He was family, really, though neither of them would use that word out loud. His grandfather had worked for Amos's father, and stories said it went back even further than that. The Ortegas and the Reddicks, tied together by this land and this work. "Morning," Miguel said, cinching his saddle. "North pasture fence is down again. Saw it yesterday evening, but ran out of light." Amos nodded. "We'll ride out after I check the heifers. Deputy Tom stopped by last night looking for you. Said he'd come back this morning. He say..." "What about?" "Just wanted to talk. You know Tom, never needs much reason to visit." Tom Harlow had been Amos's best friend since they were 8 years old. They'd grown up together, gone to school together, gotten into trouble together. Tom had joined the sheriff's department 30 years back and worked his way up to deputy. He stopped by the ranch at least once a week, usually for no better reason than wanting company and a cup of coffee. Since Sarah died, those visits had become more frequent. Amos appreciated it, even if he never said so directly. The heifers looked good, healthy and calm in the morning cool. Amos counted them out of habit, checked for any signs of illness or injury. Ranching was mostly routine, interrupted by crisis. You learned to catch problems early or pay for them later. By the time he and Miguel rode out to fix the fence, the sun was climbing and the day was warming. The high desert could be brutal in summer, freezing in winter, and unpredictable the rest of the time. Today felt like spring trying to hang on, though it was already mid-May. Wildflowers dotted the rangeland, yellow and purple against the red earth. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of shared labor. Miguel held the posts while Amos drove staples, stretching new wire where the old had broken. Good fencing was the backbone of ranching. You kept animals in and predators out, and you did it right, or you did it twice. "You heard from Daniel?" Miguel asked, as they worked. Amos drove another staple before answering. "Not since February. He sent a birthday card." "That's something. He's busy. Seattle's a long way off." Miguel didn't press. He knew the story. Daniel had left for college at 18 and never really came back. He'd built a successful career in software, married a woman. Amos had met exactly twice, lived in a world of technology and cities that might as well have been another planet. Sarah had stayed in touch better than Amos managed. After she died, the calls between father and son had grown further apart. Amos told himself it was natural. Young people left, built their own lives, nothing wrong with that. But Sarah's absence had widened the gap. She'd been the bridge between them, translating Amos's silences and Daniel's impatience into something that felt like family connection. Without her, they'd drifted into polite distance. They finished the fence by noon and rode back. Tom's patrol car was parked by the house. Tom sat on the porch steps, hat off, looking comfortable. He stood when they approached, a solid man with grey in his beard and laugh lines around his eyes. "There you are. Thought maybe you'd decided to run off and join the circus. Fixing fence," Amos said, dismounting. "Sorry to keep you waiting. I've got time. Retirement's looking good from where I stand. 6 more months, and I'm done. You'll be bored inside a week. That's what fishing's for." They went inside, and Amos made fresh coffee. The kitchen was clean but worn, appliances from the 80s, counters Sarah had kept spotless. He tried to maintain her standards but knew he fell short. The house felt different without her attention to it. Less like a home, more like a place he happened to sleep. Tom settled at the kitchen table, same seat he'd occupied 1,000 times. "Bank called me yesterday," he said after a moment. "Professional courtesy type thing." Amos set down the coffee mugs. "What they say?" "They're concerned about the ranch. Asked if I knew whether you had plans for addressing the mortgage situation." "Since when does the bank call the sheriff's department about loans?" "They don't, officially, but Carl Henderson and I go way back. He knows we're friends. He was trying to give you a heads up without calling you directly yet." Amos sat down heavily. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough they're talking foreclosure if something doesn't change." "You're 4 months behind, Amos." "I know exactly how far behind I am. I'm not judging, I'm telling you what I heard. Carl says they'll start proceedings soon unless you can catch up or work out a payment plan." Amos stared into his coffee. 4 months behind on the mortgage, 2 months behind on the note for the tractor, overdue on the feed bill, vet expenses from last fall when 3 calves got pneumonia, insurance premiums due next month. The numbers swam in his head at night, an arithmetic of failure that never added up to anything good. "Sarah's life insurance barely covered her medical bills," he said quietly. "And the funeral, I know. Beef prices dropped last quarter. Lost 2 calves to coyotes in March. I know that too. I'm not making excuses. I'm not asking for any. I'm asking what you're going to do." Amos had no answer for that. Selling off more cattle would help short-term but hurt long-term. Taking on more debt was impossible. Getting a job in town at his age, with his skill set, meant minimum wage work that wouldn't come close to covering the mortgage. The ranch was all he had, and it was slipping through his fingers. "Daniel thinks I should sell the whole place," he said finally. "Got a call from him about it a month back. Says I'm too old for this, that it's time to let go. What do you think? I think this land has been in my family since 1891. My grandfather built this ranch from nothing. My father expanded it. Sarah and I raised Daniel here. It's not just property, Tom. It's who I am. Sometimes who we are has to change." Amos looked at his friend. "You think I should sell? I think you should do what lets you sleep at night. But I also think pride's a cold companion when you're living in your truck." After Tom left, Amos walked out to the small cemetery plot on the east edge of the property. 4 graves, all Reddicks. His grandparents, his father and Sarah, simple headstones, no fuss. Sarah's was the newest, the stone still bright and unweathered. He stood there a long time, like he did most days. Talking to her felt less foolish than talking to himself. "I don't know what to do," he said to the stone. "You always had clearer sight than me. I'm fumbling here." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of sage and sun-warmed earth. No answers came, but he felt steadier somehow. Sarah wouldn't have wanted him to give up, but she wouldn't have wanted him to break himself for the sake of pride either. She'd want him to find the wise path, the one that balanced what ought to be with what could be. He just had to figure out which path that was. That evening, after Miguel had gone home and the work was done, Amos stood looking out at the barn. The light was fading, painting everything in shades of blue and purple. He noticed the ground near the northwest corner looked different, settled, somehow. Lower than he remembered. He walked over for a closer look. The earth had definitely sunk, forming a shallow depression about 6 feet across. Probably just erosion from spring runoff, he thought, or maybe a gopher colony that had collapsed. Either way, it needed attention before it got worse. He'd deal with it in the morning, add it to the list of things that needed fixing, problems that needed solving, weights that needed carrying. Inside the house, he made a simple dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. The silence pressed in around him. On the counter, a stack of mail. He'd been avoiding bills mostly, a few pieces of junk. He forced himself to open the envelopes, face the numbers, notice from the bank, formal language about delinquent payments and the possibility of foreclosure proceedings. They gave him 60 days to address the situation before they would take action. 60 days to save a ranch he could barely afford to operate. He folded the letter and set it aside, washed his dishes, turned off the lights. The old house settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs. Sarah's absence felt sharp tonight, like a fresh wound instead of an old ache. In bed, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His grandfather's picture hung on the wall across the room, a stern-faced man in a dark suit, the kind of photograph taken in a studio long ago. Samuel Reddick had started this place with nothing but determination and a land grant. Built something from dust and hard work, passed it to his son, who passed it to Amos. 3 generations of Reddicks on this land, and Amos might be the one who lost it. Outside, the high desert night was vast and star-filled. Somewhere in that darkness, the ground had shifted near the barn, creating a hollow that would need to be filled. Amos had no way of knowing that tomorrow, when he went to investigate that settled earth, his entire world would shift just as fundamentally. For now, he only knew the weight of an ending he didn't want and couldn't seem to prevent. He closed his eyes and hoped for sleep that took a long time to find. Morning came cold and clear. Amos, dressed in the dark, and made coffee, his mind already on the work ahead. The settled ground near the barn nagged at him. Better to deal with it now than wait for it to worsen. After breakfast, he gathered what he thought he'd need: a shovel, a pickaxe, maybe some lumber to shore up whatever had collapsed beneath. Miguel wouldn't arrive for another hour, so Amos headed out alone. The depression looked worse in daylight. Not just settled, partially collapsed, with one edge showing a dark gap where earth had fallen away into something underneath. He knelt at the edge, peering down. The opening was maybe 2 feet across, leading into darkness that his eyes couldn't penetrate. He fetched a flashlight from the barn and shone it down. The beam caught rough stone walls, hand-carved by the look of them. Not a natural cavity. Someone had dug this deliberately. Amos sat back on his heels, puzzled. In all his years on this ranch, he'd never seen anything suggesting tunnels or underground structures. His grandfather's generation had built the barn and house, cleared the land, established the basics of the operation, but this looked older than that. Or hidden so well that generations had forgotten about it. Curiosity overtook caution. He widened the opening with the shovel, carefully removing loose earth until he'd created a gap large enough to climb through. The smell that rose up was cool and dry, untouched air that hadn't circulated with the surface in a very long time. He went back to the barn and found rope, tied one end to a sturdy fence post, and dropped the other end into the hole. Then he retrieved the old iron lantern that hung by the tackroom door, kerosene-fueled heavy glass, the kind his grandfather might have used. It still worked. He lit it, tested the flame, and destitutioned, made sure the bale was secure. Standing at the edge of the hole, Amos felt a moment of doubt. He was 62 years old, alone, about to climb into an underground space that might be unstable. If something went wrong, Miguel wouldn't arrive for 40 minutes. Nobody would know where to look, but the opening pulled at him. Whatever was down there had been hidden for decades. It was on his land. He had a right to know what it was. He looped the lantern handle over his belt, gripped the rope, and lowered himself into the earth. The descent was only about 8 feet. His boots touched solid rock floor, and he released the rope. The lantern's glow pushed back the darkness, revealing a space much larger than he'd expected. He stood in a tunnel, roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, carved through solid rock. The walls showed chisel marks, methodical and patient. Timber beams reinforced the ceiling every few feet, old wood that looked remarkably sound given its age. The tunnel stretched forward into darkness beyond his lantern's reach. Amos moved slowly, testing each step. The floor was level, cleared of debris. Whoever had made this had done so with care and skill. The air was stale but breathable, dry enough that nothing had rotted or grown mold. After 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a chamber. The space was perhaps 12 feet square, carved out of the rock like the tunnel, but this room had been furnished. Against one wall stood wooden crates stacked carefully. Metal boxes sat alongside them. A small table, collapsed with age, lay in one corner. The remains of what might have been shelves clung to another wall. Amos raised the lantern higher. The crates were marked with dates 1893, 1894. Stenciled letters identified contents, hardware, provisions, records. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed for longer than he'd been alive. He approached the nearest crate and worked the lid free. The wood was dry but not rotted. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, he found bars of metal. He lifted one out, wiped away the dust, and recognized it immediately. Gold. The bar was heavy, maybe 2 pounds, stamped with marks he didn't recognize but couldn't mistake. He set it on the floor and checked the rest of the crate. More bars, all identical, all wrapped and preserved against time. His hands shook as he opened the next crate. More gold. And the next. And the next. The chamber held a fortune. Even with gold prices he only vaguely knew, this represented wealth beyond anything his ranch would ever generate. Enough to pay off every debt, save the property, live comfortably for the rest of his days. But why was it here? Who had hidden it? And why had it stayed hidden? He turned to the metal boxes. The first one he opened held documents, papers yellow with age, carefully folded. He unfolded one gently, held it close to the lantern light. It was a legal document, formal language, dated the 15th of June, 1893. He skimmed the contents, struggling with the archaic phrasing. Something about a trust, a collective agreement, provisions for community development. Names listed at the bottom, 12 signatures. Some he recognized as old family names from the area. Others looked indigenous, Apache, if he had to guess. And there, third from the top, Samuel Reddick, his grandfather. Amos lowered the document, his heart pounding. He opened another metal box and found a journal, leather-bound, pages filled with careful handwriting. He recognized it from old letters he'd seen in his father's papers, his grandfather's hand. He opened to the first page. June 1893. The pact is made. 12 families, settler and Apache both, have agreed to pool our resources for the good of all. The troubles of recent years have shown us that division brings only suffering. Together, we will build something lasting, a school, a hospital, institutions that serve everyone regardless of origin. The gold represents our combined wealth, held in trust. I am named trustee, charged with keeping it safe until the time is right to build. Amos read on, page after page of his grandfather's neat script. The journal detailed the agreement, the contributions each family made, the hopes they shared. It spoke of unity across old divisions, of indigenous families and settlers working toward a common future after years of conflict and mistrust. It spoke of a promise. But Amos had never heard of any school or hospital built by his grandfather. The promise, whatever it had never been kept. He continued reading. Later entries showed doubt creeping in. The territorial government refuses to grant permits. They say mixing white children and Indian children in school would cause problems. The Apache families grow suspicious of the delays. I fear the alliance is fracturing. Then, it has been 2 years. The moment has passed. Some Apache families have moved to the reservation, others have dispersed. The settler families talk of using the funds for other purposes, a private school, a town hall for our community alone. But that would betray the pact. I cannot allow it. The final entry, dated 1897, I have decided to keep the trust intact. Perhaps a future generation will have the wisdom to fulfill what we intended. Until then, it remains hidden, waiting for a time when the promise can be honored properly. May God forgive us for failing to do what was right when the chance was ours. Amos closed the journal and sat down heavily on one of the crates. His grandfather had hidden this fortune, this promise, and taken the secret to his grave. His father had apparently never known or never spoken of it. 3 generations, and the gold had sat here undisturbed while the promise it represented remained broken. He looked around the chamber with new eyes. This wasn't just treasure, it was a betrayal. His family had been entrusted with something sacred, an alliance between peoples who had every reason not to trust each other. Wealth pooled for a shared dream, and they had buried it. The implications made him dizzy. The families who had contributed to this trust, what had become of them? Some were Apache, moved to reservations or scattered. Others were settlers whose descendants might still live in the area. They had given their resources believing something would be built. Nothing had been, and now Amos had found it. Gold that could save his ranch, gold that wasn't his. Gold that represented a 100-year-old promise his family had failed to keep. He climbed out of the tunnel slowly, the journal tucked under his arm, his mind spinning. The sun was bright after the darkness below. Miguel's truck was pulling up the drive. Amos stood there, blinking in the light, holding his grandfather's confession. Everything he'd worried about yesterday, the mortgage, the bills, the slow collapse of his life's work seemed suddenly small compared to the weight he now carried. He had found the answer to his financial problems. But in finding it, he discovered something far more complicated. A debt that went beyond money, into matters of honor and history and promises that should never have been broken. Miguel walked over, saw the expression on Amos's face, and stopped. What happened? Amos looked at the hole in the ground, then at his friend. I found something, he said quietly, and I don't know what to do about it. Amos spent 3 days reading his grandfather's journals in secret. He told Miguel only that he'd found some old family papers. Nothing more. Not yet. He needed to understand the full scope of what he'd discovered before he could explain it to anyone else. Each evening after the work was done, he'd descend into the tunnel with the lantern and sit in that underground chamber, reading page after page of careful handwriting. His grandfather's voice came through clearly earnest, conflicted, ultimately defeated by circumstances he couldn't control or by fears he couldn't overcome. The story that emerged was more complex than that first entry suggested. In 1891, Samuel Reddick had arrived in the territory as a young man with a land grant and ambition. The Apache Wars were officially over, but tension remained thick. Most settlers viewed the indigenous people with suspicion or outright hostility. Most Apache viewed settlers as thieves and liars, which, Samuel admitted in his journal, they often were. But Samuel had been helped early on by an Apache family when his wagon broke down in harsh country. They could have ignored him, or worse. Instead, they fed him, helped him repair his wheel, and guided him to safer passage. That kindness had shifted something in him. Over the next years, he'd built relationships with several Apache families who remained in the area rather than moving to the reservation. He'd traded fairly, hired workers regardless of their background, and spoken against the worst of the territorial government's policies. It hadn't made him popular among other settlers, but it had earned him trust from an unexpected quarter. The pact emerged from practical necessity. A harsh winter in 1892 had killed cattle and depleted resources for everyone. The territorial government offered no help. The idea formed slowly: what if both communities pooled resources to create institutions that would help all? A school where children could learn, regardless of who they were. A medical facility where care was available to whoever needed it. 12 families had committed. 6 settler families, including Samuel's, contributed gold and cash they'd saved. 6 Apache families contributed gold they'd kept hidden from government seizure, along with valuable trade goods converted to currency. The total sum, even in 1893, had been substantial. By modern standards, it represented a fortune. Samuel had been chosen as trustee because he'd earned trust from both sides. The plan was to wait for the right moment when territorial authorities would permit such institutions and then build. They'd drawn up legal documents, signed agreements, witnessed and notarized. But the right moment never came. Permits were denied. Political opposition mounted. Some settler families grew impatient and wanted to redirect the funds to projects that would serve only their community. Some Apache families, facing increasing pressure to relocate, needed their contributions back. The alliance fractured. Samuel had chosen to hide everything rather than betray either side by using the funds improperly. He'd hoped, the journal said, that a future generation might have the wisdom and opportunity his generation lacked. Amos found a metal box containing other artifacts, a compass, silver, engraved with words in English on one side, 2 paths, 1 direction, and what he assumed were Apache words on the other. A ceremonial pipe, carved wood and stone, clearly made with great skill and care. Photographs of the 12 families together, standing outside what looked like Samuel's original cabin. Everyone wore formal clothing, expressions serious, but there was dignity in the image. These weren't enemies forced together. These were people who'd chosen to try something different. On the 4th evening, while he and Miguel were mending tack in the barn, Amos finally spoke. "Miguel, I need to show you something." Miguel looked up from the bridle he was working on. "All right. It's big and complicated, and I probably should have told you sooner." They walked to the collapsed area. Amos had secured the opening properly, installed a better ladder. He'd been going down daily. Miguel followed him into the tunnel, his silence speaking volumes as they descended. In the chamber, Amos lit 2 lanterns. Miguel stood still, taking in the crates, the boxes, the preserved space. His expression shifted from confusion to shock as Amos opened a crate and showed him the gold bars. "Holy Mother of—" Miguel stopped, crossed. Himself, "Amos, what is this?" "Sit down. This takes some explaining." Amos walked him through everything: the discovery, the journals, the pact, the families involved. When he got to the list of names, he pointed to one specifically: Antonio Ortega, $1,893. Contributed $200 and a parcel of traded goods worth another $100. Miguel stared at the entry. My great-great-grandfather? That's my understanding. Our families have been connected to this land longer than either of us knew, and for more complicated reasons. Miguel sat heavily on one of the crates. Why didn't anyone know about this? My grandfather kept the secret. I don't think my father ever knew. The promise was broken before it could be kept, so Samuel buried everything literally and figuratively. The gold alone must be worth millions, probably. I haven't done the math exactly, but yes. Enough to solve every problem I've got and then some. Miguel looked at him sharply. But it's not mine. Miguel, it never was. 12 families pooled their resources to build something for everyone. My grandfather was supposed to be the trustee, not the owner, and he failed. He kept the money instead of returning it or fulfilling the promise. That was over 100 years ago, Amos. Most of those people are long dead. Their descendants aren't. They sat in silence, the lantern light casting shadows on the rock walls. Finally, Miguel spoke again. My bisabuela used to tell stories about the old days. She said there were promises made that should have been kept, said there were debts that outlast the people who owe them. I always thought she was talking about the government breaking treaties. Maybe she knew more than I realized. This kind of secret has weight, Amos said. It doesn't just belong to me. Your family was part of it too. So what are you going to do? That was the question that kept Amos awake at night. He could take the gold, pay off his debts, save the ranch. Nobody living knew about the pact. Nobody would be able to prove the gold wasn't his by right of discovery on his own land. He could keep the secret his grandfather had kept and let another generation pass. Or he could honor the promise. Try to find the descendants of those 12 families, tell them what happened, and give them what was rightfully theirs, even if it meant losing his ranch. Even if it meant exposing his family's failure. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I needed you to know. This involves your family too. Your ancestors gave to this, believed in it. You have a right to know what happened to it. Miguel stood and walked slowly around the chamber, looking at everything with new eyes. He picked up the silver compass, read the inscription, set it down carefully. Your ranch is about to go into foreclosure. This gold could save you. But you're thinking about giving it away. I'm thinking about what's right, and what's right might cost you. Everything. Yes. Miguel turned to face him. My bisabuela also said, what you owe you must pay. If not in life, then let it poison death. She meant that debts don't just disappear. They rot things from inside if you don't settle them. I remember Sarah saying something similar, that living with what's wrong breaks a person slowly. She was a wise woman. She would tell me to honor the pact. I know she would. Then maybe that's your answer. They climbed out together, both men carrying the weight of what they now knew. The sun was setting, painting the high desert in shades of gold that suddenly seemed ironic. All that wealth below ground, and it might as well have been lead for all the good it could do Amos if he chose the path of integrity. Miguel stopped before getting in his truck. Amos, whatever you decide, if you decide to make this right, I'm with you. My family's honor is tied to this too. After Miguel drove away, Amos walked to Sarah's grave. The evening was quiet, just wind in the juniper and the distant call of a hawk. He sat on the ground beside her headstone and spoke to the silence. I found something, Sarah. Something that could save us. Save the ranch. Everything you loved about this place. But it would mean living a lie. Would mean continuing the betrayal my grandfather started. He paused, picking at the dry grass. You always said do what's right, even when it costs everything. I'm trying to figure out if I'm that strong, if I can do what you would have done. The wind moved across the grave, carrying no answers, only the smell of sage and the coming night. Amos sat there until the stars came out, wrestling with a choice he knew he couldn't avoid much longer. The town's historical society occupied a converted storefront on Main Street, sandwiched between a feed store and a diner that had been serving the same breakfast menu since 1967. Claire Whitmore had run the place for 15 years, turning it from a dusty archive into something approaching a real museum. She was Sarah's cousin, which made her family by marriage, and she'd been kind to Amos after Sarah died in ways he hadn't forgotten. He found her cataloguing old photographs at a desk near the window. She looked up when the bell over the door chimed, and her face brightened. "Amos Reddick, what brings you to town?" "Need some help with family history research," he said, removing his hat. "Pull up a chair." "That's what I'm here for." He'd brought photocopies of the packed document, careful not to reveal everything at once. The paper showed the names of the 12 families and the date, but he'd left the financial details and most of the legal language obscured, just enough to seem like he was researching old land agreements. Claire put on reading glasses and studied the document carefully. 1,893. This is from right after the territory opened up for more settlement. She looked closer at the signatures. "These names are interesting. You've got established settler families mixed with Apache names. That's unusual for the period. Can you tell me anything about them? Who they were? What happened to their families?" "Some I recognize right off. The Hendersons. They're still around. Carl at the bank is a direct descendant. The Whitakers moved east in the 30s during the Depression. Johnson stayed in the area until the 60s. She pulled out a filing cabinet drawer, flipped through folders. "The Apache families are harder to trace. Government records from that period are spotty, and a lot of people moved to reservations or changed their names to avoid discrimination." She spread maps and census records across the desk, pointing to entries as she found them. "Naisha, that's a significant name, probably related to the Chiricahua families. There's a Mary Naish living on the White Mountain Reservation now, teaches at the school there. Lozan, also Chiricahua lineage. And Cochise descendants, of course, though by 1893 Cochise himself had been dead 20 years. Amos wrote down the names and details she provided. Claire worked efficiently, pulling records, cross-referencing dates, building family trees on scratch paper. She was good at this, connecting threads across decades. "Can I ask what this is about?" she said after a while. "This is more than casual curiosity. Family history project," Amos said, the lie sitting uncomfortably. "Just trying to understand more about my grandfather's time here." Claire looked at him over her reading glasses. She had Sarah's way of seeing through weak excuses. "Samuel Reddick was a complicated man. From what I've read, he had business dealings with Apache families at a time when most settlers wouldn't. Some people respected him for it. Others thought he was a fool or worse." "What do you know about promises he made? Agreements with local families?" "Nothing specific, but there are rumors, old stories that circulate. Some people say there was a plan once, early days, to build a school that would serve everyone. Mixed education, they called it. Radical idea for the 1,892nd. It never happened, obviously. Why not? Opposition from territorial authorities mostly. They weren't interested in integration. Apache families got pushed harder toward reservations. The moment passed, if there ever really was a moment." She paused. "Why are you really asking about this, Amos?" He gathered the papers, stood. "Just trying to understand some things. Thank you for your help, Claire. This gives me a lot to go on. If you need more, you know where to find me. And Amos, whatever you're dealing with, be careful. Old history has a way of being messier than people expect." He drove home with a folder full of genealogical information, names and addresses of descendants, connections traced through generations. The path forward was becoming clearer, even if he still didn't know if he had the courage to walk it. Tom's patrol car was in the driveway when he arrived. His friend sat on the porch steps, looking patient as stone. "Twice in 1 week," Amos said, climbing out of his truck. "People will talk. Let them. You got coffee?" Inside, Amos made a fresh pot, while Tom settled at the kitchen table. This was their pattern, unspoken but reliable. When something needed saying, they found their way to this table and this ritual. "Bank's getting serious," Tom said after a while. "Carl called again yesterday. Asked if I'd talk to you, if I knew what your plans were. I told him you were working on it. But Amos, they're running out of patience. I know. Foreclosure proceedings start in about 45 days if you can't catch up on payments or show them a solid plan. That's not much time. I know that too. Tom studied him. You seem different. Something's changed. Amos poured coffee, bought himself time to think. He trusted Tom completely. They'd been through too much together for it to be otherwise. But bringing someone else into this secret felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Found some things on the property, he said carefully. Old family papers. Made me think about choices my grandfather made, what I inherit from those choices. What kind of things? The kind that make simple problems complicated. Tom waited. He was good at waiting, at letting silence do the work words couldn't. Finally, Amos continued. If you had a debt you didn't incur but your family did, would you feel obligated to pay it? Depends on the debt. Moral debt. Someone was owed something, promised something, and your family failed to deliver. You find out about it decades later. The original people involved are gone, but descendants remain. Do you owe them? Tom sipped his coffee, considering. Law says no. You're not liable for your ancestors' broken promises, not legally. But you're not asking about law, are you? No. Then I'd say it depends on whether you can live with letting it stay broken. Some things eat at a person. Sarah used to say guilt's a slow poison. She did say that. So what'd your grandfather promise that he didn't deliver? Amos almost told him. The words were right there, pressing against his teeth, but he held back, not from lack of trust, but from uncertainty about what came next. Once he started down the path of disclosure, there would be no stopping, no taking it back. Still figuring that out, he said instead. But it's big, Tom. Bigger than just me. If you need help, you know where I am. Legal questions, research, whatever deputy's office has resources. I appreciate that. After Tom left, Amos stood at the kitchen window watching dust from the patrol car settle on the drive. The folder from Claire sat on the counter, names of families whose ancestors had been betrayed by his. His mortgage papers sat there too. Reminder of his own impending loss. 2 paths, the compass had said. 1 direction. But what direction was right? When both paths led through pain? Keeping the gold meant security bought with lies. Giving it away meant honoring truth at the cost of everything he'd worked for. Sarah's voice came to him, memory clear, as if she stood beside him. Doing right isn't about what it costs you, Amos. It's about what kind of person you can look at in the mirror. He picked up the folder of names, carried it to the table, and began studying the descendants more carefully. If he was going to do this, and somewhere in the past days he'd crossed from if to when, he needed to understand who he'd be making amends to. Not abstract concepts of justice, but real people whose ancestors had been wronged. The sun set while he worked, and he turned on lights against the gathering dark. Outside, the ranch stretched quiet and familiar, land that might not be his much longer, no matter what choice he made. The drive to White Mountain Reservation took 2 hours through high desert country that grew progressively more rugged. Amos had called ahead, explained vaguely that he was researching family history connections, and Mary Nisha had agreed to meet with him. Her voice on the phone had been cautious, but not unfriendly. He'd brought the children's school slate he'd found in the tunnel, wrapped carefully in cloth. Among all the artifacts, this one had struck him hardest, a simple wooden slate with faded inscriptions in both English and Apache. The word future, written in both languages, side by side. It represented everything the pact had meant to build and everything that had been denied. Mary's house sat on the edge of the reservation, modest and well-kept. She met him at the door, a woman in her 50s with grey threading through dark hair, wearing jeans and a teaching conference t-shirt. Her handshake was firm. "Mr. Reddick, come in." The living room was filled with books, student artwork on the walls, photographs of family spanning generations. She offered coffee, and they sat across from each other with the careful politeness of strangers, feeling out common ground. "You said this was about family connections?" she prompted. "Yes. My grandfather was Samuel Reddick. He ranched in the territory starting in 1891. I'm trying to understand his relationships with Apache families in the area, particularly around 1893. Something shifted in her expression. That's a specific year to mention. He kept journals. They reference agreements with several families. Your ancestor's name appears. Mary set down her coffee. What kind of agreements? Amos proceeded carefully, not revealing everything but enough to gauge her reaction. He mentioned the pact, the idea of shared resources for community building, the names of families involved. He watched her face change as he spoke, recognition dawning. My grandmother told me stories, she said quietly. She heard them from her mother, who heard them from her grandmother. Stories about promises made by settlers, about gold that was pooled together, about a school that was supposed to be built where our children and theirs would learn together. What else did she say? That it never happened. That the promises were broken like all promises made to our people. That the gold vanished and the families who contributed were told there was nothing to show for it. Some thought it was stolen. Others thought it never existed, that the whole thing was a trick. Amos unwrapped the slate and handed it to her. This was real. She took it, traced the inscriptions with her fingers. Her eyes filled. Where did you find this? On my property, in a place my grandfather hid things. He paused. Mrs. Naishe, I don't think the promises were broken because people didn't care. I think they were broken because my grandfather lost his courage. He kept everything hidden rather than risk using it wrong. But hidden became forgotten, and forgotten became betrayed. And you're telling me this now because I found it, because I know what happened, and because I believe in paying debts, even ones I didn't incur myself. They talked for another hour. Mary shared the oral history passed down through her family, the hope that had existed briefly in those years after the worst violence ended, the belief that some settlers really did want to build something better. The disappointment when nothing materialized, the resignation that settled in, the assumption that it had all been empty words. My grandmother became a teacher anyway, Mary said, taught on the reservation for 40 years. Always said education was how we'd survive, how we'd keep our culture while learning to navigate the world that was forced on us. She died wondering what that school from the stories would have been like. Amos felt the weight of generations between them. I can't undo what my grandfather failed to do. But I'm trying to figure out how to make it right now, if that's possible. Why? Her question was direct, searching. You could have kept this secret. Nobody knows about it. Why tell me? Because my wife taught me that living with lies breaks a person, because I'm about to lose my ranch anyway, so I might as well lose it honorably. And because your ancestors contributed to something they believed in, and they deserved to see it built. Mary walked him to his truck when he left. She still held the slate. Mr. Reddick, I don't know what you're planning, but I'll help if I can. My grandmother's memory deserves that much. The drive home gave him time to think. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd made a decision. He would reach out to all the descendants he could find, tell them the truth, and work with them to finally honor the pact. Even if it cost him the ranch. Even if it destroyed the Reddick name in this county. Daniel's rental car was parked by the house. His son sat on the porch, laptop open, looking impatient. He stood when Amos approached, tall and clean-cut in expensive casual clothes that looked out of place against the weathered ranch house. Dad, been trying to call you for 2 days. Phone doesn't work well out here. You know that. I made time to fly down. We need to talk seriously about the ranch. Inside, Amos made coffee, while Daniel launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. He'd found a buyer, a development company interested in the land for a corporate retreat center. They were offering fair market value, enough to pay off the mortgage and leave Amos with money to retire comfortably. You could move to town, maybe a condo, something manageable. Stop killing yourself out here for a losing proposition. This isn't a proposition, Daniel. It's our home. It was your home, and Mum's. But she's gone, and I left years ago. Who are you holding on to this for? The question hit harder than Daniel probably intended. Amos poured coffee. Bought time. There are things you don't know about this land, about our family's history here. Like what? That Grandpa built this place from nothing? I know the story, Dad. I grew up hearing it, but stories don't pay mortgages. Your grandfather kept secrets, important ones. I found something that changes what we thought we knew about this property. Daniel's impatience flickered toward interest. What kind of something? Amos almost told him. Almost brought him to the tunnel, showed him everything. But he looked at his son practical, focused on solutions that made financial sense, and realized Daniel would see the gold as vindication. Proof that selling was now unnecessary, that the ranch could be saved. Daniel wouldn't see the broken promise, wouldn't feel the weight of the betrayal. Would argue reasonably that mistakes made in 1893 weren't their responsibility to fix in 2024. Family papers, Amos said instead. Historical documents. Nothing that changes the immediate situation. Then we're back to the same problem. 45 days until foreclosure proceedings start. This buyer's offer is solid. It solves everything. They argued through dinner, the same circular discussion they'd had before. Daniel couldn't understand why Amos wouldn't take the practical solution. Amos couldn't explain without revealing the truth, and revealing the truth would only complicate things further. That night, Daniel slept in his old room. Amos lay awake, thinking about the distance between them, wider than mere geography. His son had built a life around pragmatism and success. Amos had built his around land and legacy. They spoke different languages now, valued different things. In the morning, Daniel left frustrated. "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable," he said, loading his bag into the rental car. "But don't wait too long. That buyer won't wait forever, and neither will the bank." Amos watched him drive away, feeling the loss of something he couldn't name. His son, his wife, possibly his ranch, everything slipping through his fingers while he wrestled with a debt older than any of them. Daniel ended up staying 3 days, not because the argument resolved, but because his flight got delayed and then cancelled, forcing him to rebook. The ranch house felt smaller with both of them in it, the silence between them heavier than conversation. On the second morning, Daniel asked to see the ranch books. Amos had nothing to hide there. The numbers told their own brutal story. They sat at the kitchen table while Daniel reviewed accounts, mortgage statements, operating costs. His expression grew grimmer with each page. "Dad, this is worse than I thought. You're not just behind on the mortgage, you're underwater on everything. Feed bills, equipment maintenance, property taxes. How have you been surviving? Day by day. That's not a plan. That's desperation. Sometimes that's all there is." Daniel pushed the papers away. "The buyer's offer is generous, given the state of things. You could walk away clean, even have money left over. I don't understand what's holding you back." Amos looked at his son across the table. "Your mother loved this place. We raised you here. 3 generations of Reddicks have worked this land, and maybe it's time to let it go. Mom would want you to be happy, not drowning in debt at your age. She'd want me to do what's right. And what's right about losing everything out of stubbornness?" The question hung between them, unanswerable without explanations. Amos wasn't ready to give. They finished breakfast in tense silence. That evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Amos made his way to the tunnel. He'd been avoiding it the past 2 days, not wanting to risk Daniel discovering it. But the pull was strong. He descended with the lantern, settled into the familiar chamber. He'd been through most of the documents, but he pulled out the metal boxes again, looking for anything he might have missed. In the third box, beneath layers of papers, he found a leather-bound ledger he hadn't examined closely before. The ledger was an accounting book, meticulously maintained. Page after page, detailed contributions to the trust fund. Not just the initial amounts, but the sources, the dates, even notes about what was sacrificed to make the contributions. Antonio Ortega, $200 cash, proceeds from cattle sale that left family without breeding stock for following year. Sarah Henderson, $150, family heirloom jewelry sold to contribute. Naish family, $300 in gold, held by family for 3 generations, given in trust for children's future. On and on it went. Every entry told a story of sacrifice, of people giving what they could barely afford to give because they believed in the shared dream. This wasn't charity or casual investment. These families had bled for this trust. Amos traced the entry for Antonio Ortega. Miguel's great-great-grandfather had sold cattle, depleted his herd, to contribute. That sacrifice had probably affected generations of the family, limiting what they could build, what they could pass down, and for what. So Samuel Reddick could hide it in the ground and let the promise die? The weight of it pressed on Amos until he had to climb out, get air, stand under the stars and try to process the magnitude of what had been stolen from these families. Not just money, hope, future, the chance to build something better. The next morning, he made his decision. He needed to show Miguel everything. His friend deserved to know the full scope of his family's involvement, their sacrifice, their right to the truth. After Daniel left, still frustrated but resigned to Amos's stubbornness, he waited for Miguel to finish the morning work. Then he took him aside. "Miguel, remember what I showed you? I need to show you more. Your family's part in this is bigger than I knew." In the tunnel, with 2 lanterns burning, Amos showed him the ledger, pointed out Antonio Ortega's entry, explained what it meant. Miguel read slowly, then read it again. "He sold cattle? We were ranchers even then? Small operation, from what I can tell. But yes, your family's been working this land as long as mine has, just in different capacities, and he gave money he couldn't afford to give for a school that never got built. Yes." Miguel sat down on one of the crates, the ledger open in his lap. His weathered hands trembled slightly. "My bisabuela used to talk about sacrifices the old ones made. She said they believed in a better future, gave everything for it. I thought she was talking about general hardship, surviving prejudice and poverty. I didn't know she meant this specifically. Your family has as much claim to this trust as any of the others. More, maybe, because you've stayed connected to this land. The Ortega family never stopped working it, even after the Reddicks failed them. What are you planning to do, Amos?" "I'm going to try to make it right, find all the descendants I can, tell them the truth, and work with them to finally honor the pact. Even if it means losing the ranch." Miguel looked around the chamber, at the gold that represented both wealth and betrayal. "This gold could save you. Save both of us, really. I'd have work if the ranch survived." "I know, but you're going to give it away. I'm going to give it back. There's a difference." Miguel was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, set the ledger down carefully. "My bisabuela used to say, what you owe, you must pay if not in life, then let it poison death. I never fully understood what she meant until now. This debt has been poisoning things for generations. The Reddick family's guilt, my family's unknowing sacrifice, all the other families who were betrayed. It's rotted underneath everything. So you understand why I have to do this? I understand, and I'm with you. Whatever comes next, we face it together. My family's honor is tied to this too, and I want to see it restored." They climbed out together as the sun reached its peak. Amos felt lighter despite the enormity of what lay ahead. Having Miguel fully in the secret, fully committed to setting things right, made the path seem less impossible. That afternoon, Tom stopped by, unannounced. He found Amos and Miguel sitting on the porch, drinking coffee and discussing logistics in careful terms. "You two look like you're planning something," Tom observed, settling on the steps. Amos and Miguel exchanged glances. Then Amos made another decision. "Tom, come inside. There's something you need to see." By evening, Tom knew everything. He'd descended into the tunnel, seen the gold, read portions of the journals and the ledger. Now he sat at the kitchen table, processing it all while Amos refilled coffee cups. "This is going to shake the whole county," Tom said finally. "People are going to have opinions. Some won't want to see Reddick reputation tarnished. Others will be angry it stayed hidden so long. I know. And legally. This is complicated. The gold might be considered archaeological find, requiring notification to authorities. The trust documents have legal implications. The land ownership might even come into question if those old agreements were properly filed. I figured there'd be legal complications. But you're doing it anyway. I am. Tom leaned back, studied his friend. You're the most stubborn man I know, Amos Reddick, but you're also the most honorable. If you say this needs to be made right, I believe you. As an officer, do I have a legal obligation to report this immediately? Tom considered carefully. The gold's been there 100 years. A few more weeks to handle this properly won't constitute concealment of found property, and the trust documents are civil matters, not criminal. So no, I don't think you're breaking any laws by taking time to figure out the right approach. But Amos, once you start this process, there's no stopping it. You sure you're ready? No, but I'm doing it anyway. After Tom left, Amos stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the high desert gold. Somewhere out there were descendants of 11 other families, people whose ancestors had been betrayed by his grandfather. Soon he would contact them, tell them the truth, and begin the work of fulfilling a promise that should have been kept generations ago. The ranch might be lost. His family's reputation might be destroyed. His son might never understand or forgive him. But for the first time since Sarah died, Amos felt certain he was doing something that mattered more than his own comfort, more than his own survival. He was choosing truth over ease, honor over security. It was, he thought, exactly what she would have wanted him to do. 3 evenings later, Amos returned to the tunnel alone. He'd been over the documents dozens of times, but something nagged at him. Some detail he'd overlooked, some piece that didn't quite fit the pattern he'd constructed in his mind. The chamber felt different in solitude, quieter, more intimate with the past. He lit 2 lanterns, settled on the floor with the metal boxes spread around him, and began a more methodical search. Most of the boxes he'd already examined thoroughly, but there was one, wedged in the back corner beneath a collapsed shelf, that he'd only glanced at briefly. The wood was darker, better sealed. When he pried it open, he found the contents wrapped in oilskin, preserved even more carefully than the other documents. Inside was a deed. Not a copy, an original, with seals and notary marks and formal legal language in elaborate script. He brought it close to the lantern light and began to read. The first few paragraphs were standard property transfer language. Samuel Reddick had purchased 200 acres in 1891, the parcel that would become the ranch. Amos knew this part of the story. The land grant, the purchase, the establishment of the homestead. But then the language shifted into something more complex. An addendum, dated June 1893, added after the original deed had been filed. Whereas the undersigned parties have entered into a pact for the mutual benefit of all signatory families, and whereas said pact requires land for the establishment of educational and medical institutions, and whereas Samuel Reddick holds title to suitable property, Amos's heart began to pound. Therefore, Samuel Reddick does hereby place said property into trust for the collective use of all signatory families, to be held by him as trustee until such time as the institutions described in the accompanying pact are established, at which point title shall transfer to said institutions or their designated governing body. Should the trustee fail to execute the terms of the pact within reasonable time, or should the trust be breached by action or inaction, title shall revert to the collective heirs of the signatory families in equal shares. Amos read it again. Then again. The legal language was clear enough. His grandfather hadn't just been trustee of the gold. He'd placed the land itself, the ranch, every acre, into the trust. This property wasn't Reddick land held in fee simple. It was trust land, held conditionally, meant to eventually house the school and hospital the pact had promised to build. And Samuel Reddick had failed to fulfill the trust, which meant, by the terms of this deed addendum, the land had reverted to the collective ownership of the descendant families. Amos sat back against the rock wall, the deed trembling in his hands. His family had been living on, working, and claiming ownership of land they had no legal right to, not for years, for over a century. 3 generations of Reddicks building a ranch on borrowed ground, never knowing the truth. Or had they known? Had his father been told and buried the knowledge? Had Samuel confessed on his deathbed, sworn his son to secrecy? There was no way to know. His father had died young, only 62, sudden heart attack, while fixing fence. He'd taken whatever he knew with him. The implications cascaded through Amos's mind like falling rocks. He'd been agonizing over whether to give away the gold to save the ranch. But the ranch had never been his to save. Even if he kept every gold bar, even if he paid off the mortgage and operated debt-free for the rest of his life, he'd be occupying land that legally belonged to 24 other people. The cruel irony cut deep. He'd found the solution to his financial crisis and discovered it was meaningless. The gold couldn't save property he had no legitimate claim to. He climbed out of the tunnel near midnight, emerged into cool air that felt thin after the underground chamber. The stars were sharp overhead, the same stars that had watched his grandfather bury this truth, watched his father live in ignorance or complicity, watched Amos himself struggle to keep something that was never his family's to keep. The ranch spread around him in the darkness: barn, fences, pastures, the house where he'd raised Daniel, where Sarah had died. Every board, every nail, every fence post existed on land held in fraudulent trust. His whole life, his whole identity, built on a foundation that had crumbled away the moment he found these documents. He walked to Sarah's grave, sat down beside the headstone. The grief was fresh tonight, complicated by this new knowledge. "You would have hated this," he said to the stone. "You always valued truth above everything. You would have told me to fix it immediately, no matter what it cost. And you'd have been right." He thought about the mortgage, the foreclosure proceedings. In a bitter way, they didn't matter anymore. The bank could take the property, but they'd be taking land the Reddicks had no right to sell them a mortgage on in the first place. The whole financial structure of his life was built on false ownership. Unless he buried everything again, destroyed the deed addendum, claimed he never found it, then the ranch would remain legally his according to public records. The gold could solve his money problems. He could live out his days here, die, and be buried next to Sarah, and no one would ever know, except he would know. He'd know every day for the rest of his life that he was living a lie his grandfather had started and he'd chosen to continue. He'd know that every morning he stood on this porch looking at his land. It wasn't his at all. He'd know that families had been cheated not just of gold, but of the very ground their money had helped secure for the community's future. Sarah's voice came to him clearly. "Doing right isn't about what it costs you, Amos. It's about what kind of person you can look at in the mirror." He sat there until dawn started to grey the eastern sky. By the time the sun rose, he'd made his decision. He would disclose everything: the gold, the broken promise, and the fraudulent land ownership. He would contact all the descendants, tell them the complete truth, and work with them to determine what should happen to the property. It meant losing everything. Not just the ranch as an operating concern, but his very claim to the land itself. The house he'd lived in for 40 years, the graves of his family. Everything would have to be negotiated with the rightful owners, people his family had unknowingly stolen from. Inside, he made coffee with shaking hands. The deed sat on the kitchen table, damning and undeniable. He needed legal advice now. Someone who understood both the historical context and the complex jurisdictional issues involved. Tribal law, property law, trust law, all tangled together across more than a century. He remembered Claire mentioning her brother was a tribal law attorney in Phoenix. Someone who worked in exactly this kind of complicated legal space, who understood both the settler legal system and indigenous sovereignty issues. He found Claire's number, waited until a reasonable hour, and called. "Claire, it's Amos Reddick. Remember you said your brother James was a tribal law attorney?" "Yes, why?" I need to talk to him. It's about those family documents I was researching. Turns out they're more complicated than I thought. A lot more complicated. There was a pause. Amos, what did you find? Something that changes everything. Can you put me in touch with your brother? This is important. And urgent. I'll call him today. But Amos, if this is what I think it might be, if Samuel Reddick's dealings with Apache families involved anything illegal or unethical, you need to be prepared for consequences. I am. That's why I'm calling. After he hung up, he walked outside. Miguel's truck was pulling in for the morning work. Amos met him by the barn. Found something else last night, something that makes everything worse. Miguel's expression shifted to concern. How much worse? The land itself was part of the trust. My grandfather placed the ranch property into collective ownership. We've been living on land that legally belongs to all the descendant families. Miguel let out a long breath. So even if you wanted to keep the gold to save the ranch isn't mine to save. It never was. They stood in silence, watching the sun climb above the red rock cliffs. Everything was different now, even though nothing visible had changed. The barn still needed its roof fixed. The cattle still needed tending. The fence still required mending. But all of it existed on borrowed ground, and the debt had come due after 130 years. What now? Miguel asked. Now, I contact a lawyer who can help me navigate this properly. Then I contact the families. And then I find out what it means to truly make amends for something you didn't do but inherited the responsibility for. Your grandfather should have done this. Yes, but he didn't. So, it falls to me. Miguel put a hand on Amos's shoulder. We'll get through this. I don't know how, but we will. Amos nodded, grateful for the support even as he felt the weight of what lay ahead. The path forward was clear now, even if it led through the loss of everything he'd thought was his. There was no more agonizing over whether to give away the gold while keeping the land. Both had to be returned to their rightful owners. Both were part of the same broken promise. The only choice left was how to do it with as much dignity and honor as he could manage, how to transform his grandfather's cowardice into something approaching justice, however late, however costly. James Whitmore's office occupied the third floor of a building in downtown Phoenix, 5 hours south of the ranch. Amos made the drive on a Wednesday, the truck's air conditioning fighting against desert heat that shimmered off the highway. He carried a briefcase with copies of everything, journals, the packed document, the ledger, the deed addendum, photographs of the artifacts. The office was professional but comfortable, decorated with a mix of contemporary furniture and traditional artwork. Photographs showed James with various tribal leaders at legal conferences, receiving awards. This was someone who navigated both worlds, exactly what Amos needed. James Whitmore was in his 50s, dressed in business casual, with the same intelligent eyes his sister Claire had. He shook Amos's hand firmly and gestured to a conference table. Claire said, "This involved historical land issues, and Samuel Reddick, I've done some preliminary research on the period. Let's see what you've brought." For the next 2 hours, Amos laid it all out. He started with finding the tunnel, moved through discovering the gold and documents, explained the pact and the broken promise. James listened without interrupting, taking notes, examining each document carefully. When Amos reached the deed addendum, James went very still. He read it 3 times, pulled out his laptop, and started cross-referencing territorial land laws from the 1892. "This is extraordinary," he said finally, "and legally complex in ways that will take weeks to fully unpack, but the core issue is clear enough. Your grandfather placed the property in trust with specific conditions. He failed to meet those conditions. The reversion clause is explicit, so the land legally belongs to the descendant families. Potentially. We'd need to verify the deed addendum was properly filed, which, given the other documents were hidden, seems unlikely. That creates interesting questions about title validity. But even if the addendum wasn't filed, the trust relationship it describes creates obligations." James pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a timeline. 1,893. Trust established. Land placed as security. 1,897. Samuel Reddick's final journal entry acknowledges failure. Sometime after that, probably within a few years, the trust is completely abandoned. From then until now, Reddicks operate the ranch as if they have clear title. Can they challenge my claim? The descendants force me off the land? They could try. Statute of limitations would be their biggest obstacle. After this much time, even if the trust relationship existed, arguing for enforcement would be difficult. But here's what matters more than law. James leaned forward. This isn't really about property law. It's about historical injustice and whether you're willing to address it voluntarily. That's why I'm here, to figure out how to make this right. Then we need to talk about restorative justice approaches rather than adversarial legal strategies. James explained the concept, bringing affected parties together, creating space for truth-telling and collective decision-making, focusing on healing rather than punishment. It was an approach increasingly used in cases involving historical wrongs, particularly those affecting indigenous communities. That's clearly stolen property held in trust. The families have legitimate claim to it, regardless of statutes of limitations. This is a continuing harm, not a single past act. But the land is murkier. You could argue adverse possession, that your family's good faith occupation for over a century creates rights. The descendants might accept that argument or might not. What would you recommend? Full disclosure. Bring all the descendants together and I can help you identify and contact them. Present everything you found. Acknowledge the betrayal honestly. Then negotiate together what should happen. Maybe they want the land. Maybe they want the gold liquidated and distributed. Maybe they want to finally build what was promised. Let them decide collectively, rather than imposing a solution. And if they want me off the property immediately, then you negotiate terms that are fair. You've lived there in good faith. You didn't know about the hidden documents. Any reasonable resolution would give you time to relocate, possibly compensation for improvements your family made over the years. But Amos, you need to prepare yourself for losing the ranch entirely. That's the likely outcome of this process. Amos had known this intellectually, but hearing it stated plainly still felt like a blow. I understand. Why are you doing this? James asked. You could have kept the gold, ignored the deed addendum, lived out your days on the property, and no one would ever have known. Why tell anyone? My wife taught me that living with lies breaks a person, and I saw what my grandfather's cowardice created, a wound that never healed, families who never got what they were promised. I can't undo history, but I can refuse to keep living a lie. James studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. I'll help you do this properly. Give me 2 weeks to contact descendants, verify lineages, arrange a meeting location. We'll need a neutral space, probably the tribal community center. I'll facilitate the initial gathering, help establish ground rules for discussion. What should I expect? Anger, demands, both, probably. Pain that's been passed down through generations. Mistrust of settlers in general and your family specifically. But also, possibly, appreciation that you're trying to make amends. Willingness to work together if you approach this with genuine humility and openness. They spent another hour discussing logistics. James would prepare a full legal analysis of the documents. He'd create a genealogical chart showing all descendant families. He'd draft a proposed process for the restorative justice approach with clear steps and expected outcomes. This will cost legal fees I'm not sure I can pay, Amos said as they wrapped up. Let me worry about that. Some of this is pro bono historical justice work I do, and if there's gold to be distributed, legal fees can come from that. You're doing the right thing, Amos. I want to help. The drive home felt different, lighter somehow. Despite knowing he'd committed to a process that would end with losing his ranch, he'd taken the first real step toward resolution. The secret was expanding beyond his small circle, moving toward the full disclosure that was both necessary and terrifying. He stopped at Sarah's grave before going inside. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. "I saw a lawyer today," he told her, stone. "Started the process of making this right. James Whitmore, good man, reminds me of you in some ways, clear-eyed about what's right. He's going to help me bring everyone together, tell the truth about what Samuel did and what needs to happen now." The wind moved through the grass, warm and steady. "I'm going to lose the ranch, the land, the house, probably everything. But you always said truth matters more than comfort. I'm finally listening. I hope you're proud of me, wherever you are. I hope you understand why this is worth it." Miguel was waiting at the house when he arrived. Tom had joined him, and they sat on the porch drinking beer in the twilight. Amos accepted a bottle and settled into his chair. "How'd it go?" Miguel asked. "James is going to help. He'll contact all the descendants, arrange a meeting, probably 2 weeks from now. Then we tell everyone everything and negotiate what happens next." "You really doing this?" Tom said. "Not a question. I am. Daniel know yet?" "No. I'll tell him after the meeting. No point in having that argument twice." They sat in companionable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. These were the men who'd stood with him. Miguel, who'd worked beside him for 30 years, Tom, who'd been his friend since childhood. Their loyalty meant more than any amount of gold. "Whatever happens," Miguel said quietly, "it's been an honor working this land with you. We're not done yet. Still, got cattle to tend until someone tells us different." Tom raised his bottle. "To doing what's right, even when it costs everything." They clinked bottles, drank, and sat watching the night deepen over land that might not be Amos's much longer. The familiar landscape felt precious now, in a way it hadn't before, not as possession, but as borrowed gift about to be returned. Over the next 2 weeks, Amos worked the ranch with renewed attention. He fixed things that didn't strictly need fixing, mended fences that could have lasted another season, organized the tack room, cleaned and oiled tools, making the place right for whoever would inherit it. James called regularly with updates. He'd found 23 descendants of the original 12 families. Some lived locally, others as far away as California and New Mexico. Most had agreed to attend the meeting, curious about why they were being contacted about events from 1893. Mary Naish called too. "James Whitmore contacted me. He said you're doing something extraordinary. Thank you for not letting this stay buried. I'm just trying to fix my grandfather's mistake. A lot of people wouldn't. They'd keep the gold and say it was too long ago to matter. But it does matter. To us, to our family's memories, it matters deeply." The bank sent another notice. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 14 days. Amos filed it away, knowing it might not matter once the truth came out. How do you foreclose on land someone doesn't actually own? Daniel called on the 13th day. "Dad, I've been looking at your accounts. The bank's about to move on foreclosure. You've got to make a decision now about selling." "I'm handling it." "How?" "You won't take the buyer's offer. You can't catch up on payments." "What's your plan?" "You'll understand soon, I promise." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. Trust me, son." After he hung up, Amos went to the tunnel one last time. He stood in the chamber with the lantern, looking at the gold bars, the documents, the artifacts that had stayed hidden for so long. Tomorrow he would load copies of everything into his truck and drive to the tribal community center. Tomorrow the secret would finally be exposed to the light. He picked up the ceremonial peace pipe, felt its weight, the smoothness of wood worn by hands long gone. This had been given to his grandfather in trust, symbol of unity and shared hope. Tomorrow he would return it, along with everything else that should never have been taken. The lantern flame reflected off the gold, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. All this wealth, and it had brought his family nothing but hidden shame. Better to be poor and honest than rich on the backs of broken promises. He climbed out, secured the opening, and walked back to the house. Tomorrow, everything changed. Tomorrow he stopped being Amos Reddick, rancher and landowner, and became something else, the man who chose truth over comfort, honor over security, justice over inheritance. It was, he thought, as he turned off the lights and went to bed, Exactly what Sarah would have wanted, and that mattered more than anything else. Daniel arrived unannounced the morning of the meeting. Amos was loading boxes into his truck when the rental car pulled up, and his stomach dropped. Not now. Not today. Dad, we need to talk. Daniel's face was tight with frustration. The bank called me as your emergency contact. Foreclosure hearing is in 3 days. They wanted to know if I could convince you to cooperate with the sale. I know when the hearing is. Then why aren't you doing anything about it? Amos set down the box he was carrying. There was no avoiding this conversation now. Come with me. There's something you need to see. He led Daniel to the tunnel entrance, down the ladder into the chamber. Watched his son's face change as the lantern light revealed the gold, the documents, the preserved space of secrets. What is this? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Your great-grandfather's shame. Our family's debt. The reason I haven't sold the ranch. He walked Daniel through the discovery, the journals, the broken promise. Showed him the ledger with family's sacrifices recorded. Explained the pact, the hope that had existed, the betrayal that followed. Daniel's shock gradually transformed into something else. Dad, this is incredible. This gold, it's the solution. Don't you see we're saved? The ranch can continue. No, it's not ours. It was hidden on our property, found by you. That makes it legally yours under finder's laws. It was held in trust. Stolen, effectively, by my grandfather when he failed to honor the pact. That was over 100 years ago. Those people are dead. You can't be responsible for something you didn't do. Their descendants are very much alive, and there's more. Amos showed him the deed addendum, explained what it meant. The land itself was part of the trust. We've been living on property that legally belongs to the collective heirs of those 12 families. Daniel stared at the document, then at his father. You can't be serious. You're going to give away gold and the ranch because of some agreement from 1893. I'm going to honor a promise my grandfather should have kept. This is insane. Mom would want you to be practical, to save what you've built. Your mother would want me to do what's right. She always did. I can't believe this. Daniel's voice rose. You're throwing away our entire family legacy, our home, everything, because of some misguided sense of obligation to people who have no legal claim. They have every moral claim. And I'm not throwing it away, I'm returning what was never ours to keep. They argued up the ladder into the morning light. Daniel's corporate logic crashed against Amos's immovable decision. Nothing Amos said could make Daniel understand why this mattered more than financial security, why truth mattered more than survival. I have to go, Amos said finally. There's a meeting in 2 hours. All the descendants are gathering. I'm going to tell them everything. Don't do this, Dad, please. Think about Daniel, about your grandchildren you've never met, about the future. I am thinking about the future. About what kind of man I want to be, what kind of legacy I actually want to leave. And it's not one built on lies. Daniel got in his car, face flushed with anger and disbelief. This is your choice. When you're living in your truck because you gave away everything out of pride or stubbornness or whatever this is, remember, it was your choice. Amos watched him drive away, feeling the fracture in their relationship widen into something that might never heal. Some distances, he thought, couldn't be bridged by blood alone. Miguel and Tom arrived together. Claire came in her own car, insisted on attending to support him. They formed a small convoy, heading to the tribal community center, 2 hours north. The building was newer, built with community funds, designed to serve multiple purposes. Today, it would witness something unprecedented, the exposure of a 100-year-old betrayal and the beginning of restorative justice. Amos walked in carrying the document case, flanked by his supporters. The room was arranged with chairs in a semicircle, a table at the front. 23 people were already seated, a mix of ages and backgrounds. Some he recognized from around the county. Others were strangers. All watched him enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Mary Naishay sat in the front row. She nodded to him, a small gesture of support that steadied his nerves. James Whitmore stood at the front table. He'd brought a wooden gavel. Old and worn, it had been used, he'd explained, in the original territorial courthouse. Something about its presence felt right, a link to the legal framework these families had tried to work within. James tapped the gavel once. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you are wondering why you're here, why you were contacted about events from 1893. Mr. Amos Reddick has something important to share with you. Something that involves all your families and a promise that was made but never kept." The room went quiet. Every eye turned to Amos. He stood, moved to the front, faced them all. His mouth was dry, but his hands were steady. "My name is Amos Reddick," he began. "My grandfather was Samuel Reddick, and my grandfather betrayed every single one of your families." The silence after his opening statement was absolute. Then the room erupted. Questions, accusations, disbelief crashed over him in waves. Amos raised his hands, waited for the noise to subside, and began telling the complete story. He described finding the tunnel, reading the journals, discovering the gold and documents. He passed around copies of the pact, the ledger, the deed addendum. When he reached the part about the gold still being there, untouched, gasps rippled through the room. "2 months ago I found everything my grandfather hid. The gold, the documents, proof of what should have been built. And I've been wrestling with what to do about it ever since." Mary Naish stood. "My grandmother told me about this. We thought it was just another broken promise, another lie we had to swallow. You're saying it was real? The gold existed? The plan was genuine? It was all real, and it was all betrayed." An elderly Apache man rose, leaning on a cane. "I'm Robert Cochise. Your family stole our future. We gave gold my family had hidden for generations, gold that could have helped us survive when times got hard. We believed in that promise, and it was a lie. Yes, sir. My grandfather failed. He kept the gold instead of using it or returning it. He broke faith with everyone who trusted him. I can't undo that, but I can try to make it right now." "How?" The challenge came from a middle-aged woman in the back. "You can't give us back the school we never got to attend, the medical care our grandparents died without. Money now doesn't fix what was taken then. You're right. Nothing I do can erase that harm, but I can fulfill the promise, late as it is. The gold exists, the land exists. We can finally build what was meant to be built." A settler descendant stood, face red. "My family contributed too. We didn't know about this betrayal any more than anyone else. Why should we give up potential inheritance because of your grandfather's lies?" Arguments erupted across the room. Some wanted the gold liquidated and distributed equally. Others wanted legal action, prosecution for fraud, even though the principals were long dead. Some Apache descendants wanted the land taken entirely, every acre, as partial compensation for centuries of theft. James used the gavel to restore order. "These are all understandable reactions, pain and anger that has been passed down through generations. But we're here to find a path forward, not to relitigate the past." For hours they talked, argued, processed. Amos sat silent through much of it, absorbing the anger, accepting the blame for his grandfather's cowardice. He'd expected this, knew he deserved their fury. But slowly, the conversation shifted. Younger voices began suggesting possibilities. What could be built now? What would honor the original vision while serving present needs? Miguel stood. "My name is Miguel Ortega. My great-great-grandfather Antonio gave money to this trust, sold cattle his family needed because he believed in the dream. I'm Amos's friend and employee, but I'm also descended from one of the betrayed families. I want to say Amos didn't have to tell anyone about this. He could have kept the gold, saved his ranch, and none of us would ever have known. He chose truth over security. That means something." Mary Nisha added her voice. "My grandmother died, wondering what happened to that promise. She became a teacher anyway, spent her life educating our children without the resources that school would have provided. I teach now too. We desperately need better facilities, more resources. Maybe this is our chance to finally build something. A settler descendant who was a doctor spoke up. Healthcare access on reservations is inadequate. The original plan included a hospital. We could create a community health center, serve everyone, regardless of background. Use the gold to fund construction. Transform the Reddick land into what it was always meant to be, shared space serving the community. Not charity, but partnership, like it was supposed to be from the start. James facilitated, writing proposals on a whiteboard, helping them work toward consensus. It took until evening, but gradually a plan emerged. Liquidate the gold through proper legal channels. Divide some among the families as acknowledgement of their ancestors' contributions. Use the rest to fund construction of a community center, education facility, and health clinic on the Reddick property. Create a governing board with representatives from all the descendant families. When they voted, it wasn't unanimous. Some still wanted everything sold, wealth divided, justice pursued through courts. But the majority chose the forward-looking approach. Build what should have been built. Transform betrayal into legacy. As people prepared to leave, Amos approached the front table. From his truck, he'd brought one final item, a bronze bell, tarnished but intact, that he'd found among the supplies in the tunnel. It had been purchased in 1893, meant to ring in the schoolyard that was never built. This was bought with packed money, he said, setting it on the table. For the school that never opened. Maybe when we finally open the doors, this can ring. 130 years late, but finally serving its purpose, Mary came forward, placed her hand on the bell, tears streaming down her face. My grandmother would have loved to hear this ring. Thank you, Amos. Thank you for telling the truth. They formed a committee to oversee the project, set another meeting for detailed planning. As the room emptied, Amos felt exhausted but strangely at peace. He'd lost his ranch, probably destroyed his relationship with Daniel, upended his entire life. But he'd done what Sarah would have wanted. He'd chosen truth. 6 months had passed since the night everything changed. Amos stood at the edge of what used to be empty land on the east side of town, watching the sun paint the red rocks gold. The foundation was complete now, concrete and steel rising from the earth like a promise finally kept. The community center, half school, half medical clinic, would open its doors by spring. He ran his weathered hand along the cornerstone. The names were carved deep: Reddick, Whitefeather, Broken Arrow, Martinez, Clearwater, Ortega. Settler families and Apache families, side by side, just as his grandfather had written they should be, just as they'd intended all those years ago, when the gold was hidden away, when dreams were bigger than fear. The gold hadn't made him rich. He'd kept none of it. Every bar, every coin, had gone into the trust his grandfather had described, a trust that Claire Whitmore and the tribal council had helped him establish properly, legally, with witnesses and documentation that could never be questioned. The lawyers had been skeptical at first, but the journals were clear. The history was documented. And the families named in those faded pages still had descendants who remembered the stories their great-grandparents had passed down. Stories of promises made, promises broken, and now promises kept. His ranch was still struggling. The bank still sent notices, but Amos slept better than he had in years. Some things mattered more than land. Some debts couldn't be paid in dollars. Thought I'd find you here, Amos turned. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, looking uncertain the way he always did when visiting. But he was visiting more now every other weekend, instead of twice a year. Small steps. Your mother would have liked this, Amos said, gesturing at the building site. She always said the town needed something like this. Said kids shouldn't have to travel 40 miles for a decent school. Daniel moved closer, stood beside him. You could have kept it, you know. The gold. No one would have known. I would have known. Amos looked at his son, really looked at him. saw Sarah's eyes looking back. And you would have known. Can't build anything lasting on someone else's broken promise. Your grandfather learned that. Took me too long to understand it, but I got there. The ranch will be fine. Miguel and I worked out a partnership. He's buying in, 20% now, more later if he wants. His boys are good workers. Between all of us, we'll keep it going. Amos smiled, something that came easier these days. Maybe you'll want a piece of it someday, when you're ready. No pressure. Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe. Been thinking about it more lately. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the construction crew secure the last of the day's framework. Deputy Tom pulled up in his patrol car, climbed out with 2 cups of coffee from the diner. Figured you'd be here, Tom said, handing Amos a cup. Claire wants to know if you're coming to the dedication committee meeting Thursday. Wouldn't miss it. She's putting together a display for the entrance. Wants to include your grandfather's journal in a protected case, obviously. Thinks people should know the real history. Tom sipped his coffee. Town's different now, you know. People talk to each other more. Apache families feel more welcome. Business owners are actually working together instead of competing. Funny what honesty can do. Amos thought about the night he'd made his decision, sitting at his kitchen table with those journals spread out before him. The easy path had been right there. Keep gold, pay off the ranch, tell no one. He could have rationalized it 100 different ways. But Sarah's voice had been in his head, clear as if she were standing beside him. Asterisk. Do what's right, not what's easy. Asterisk. That had always been her way. You did good, Amos, Tom said quietly. Not many men would have made the choice you made. Not many men had my grandfather's journals to read. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. You either live with it or you fix it. The sun was setting now, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Amos thought about the tunnel beneath his barn, now sealed properly with the tribal council's blessing. Thought about the generations who'd kept those secrets, who'd let that gold sit in darkness while communities struggled. Thought about his grandfather writing those journals by lamplight, knowing the promise hadn't been kept, carrying that guilt to his grave. No more secrets, no more buried promises. The foundation stone would stand for generations, long after Amos was gone. People would read those names and remember what happens when communities work together. Would remember that it's never too late to honor your word, even if that word was given by someone else a century ago. I'm heading back, Daniel said, but I'll see you next weekend. Thought maybe I'd help with the fence line on the south pasture, if you need the help. I always need the help, Amos said, and meant it. He watched his son drive away, then walked slowly back to his truck. The ranch was waiting. The cattle needed feeding. Life went on the way it always did, one day rolling into the next. But something had shifted in him, something fundamental. He wasn't the same man who'd fallen through that sinkhole 6 months ago. That fall had broken him open, and in the breaking had let the light in. As he drove home, past the red rocks and sagebrush, past the land his family had worked for 3 generations, Amos thought about legacy, not the kind measured in acres or cattle or gold bars hidden in the dark. The kind measured in promises kept, in wrongs made right, in communities healed. That was the inheritance worth leaving. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Amos drove on, heading home to the ranch that was still his, for now, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Some treasures you find in the ground, others you build with your hands and your heart, one honest choice at a time.